Good afternoon, everyone. I was asked by Paul for a title for a talk, and I thought, well, let's be slightly provocative here. Let's call it Delivering SuDS Previously Outlined. Is this reasonably practical? As that's a well-used term throughout the standards. I didn't actually expect Paul to pick me up on it and stick it in there, but there you go. Yeah, I mean, we all are very much aware of greenfield sites. Sometimes the more problematic sites can be either retrofit or where you have previous development and you're trying to get some storage back in there through betterment. So some of what I'll deliver here today is really talking about the approaches that we looked at and the considerations that we have and the constraints that we're up against. So really just very, very briefly, taking on board community aspirations, stakeholder engagement, and looking at the constraints. What we do find is that in these types of situations, the standard palette of such components sometimes doesn't fit in terms of supplying solutions, so you have to innovate and stray away from what you commonly accept. So the standard details you see in either handbooks or design guides, you need to sort of tweak that design to suit the constraint in hand. The storage is a good one to look at, and I will cover, this is predating, the project we're going to look predates the standards, even in the draft format, so we didn't have that as a guide, but the best practice has always been to try and get storage in and provide betterment where possible. But in keeping with that, it's understanding what rainfall actually falls on that catchment and what's the most effective use of storage in terms of the rainfall actually falling. There's no point in tight situations supplying greenfield runoff rates stored to 100 plus 30%. If that's only ever going to fill, well, at the minute it fills every year, but normally speaking it will fill in a very infrequent basis, so it's not an effective use of resources in this basis. And I will discuss what's practical on the back of that. This is the site and the scheme that we're involved in. It was myself and Bob Ray at Dream Team looked at it. I guess exactly. I was dreaming. It's a site just outside the Gherkin, currently been redeveloped. What the client, which was City of London, wanted to look at was incorporating a SuDS element to the scheme. So they didn't just want a hard landscape over again and regenerate the site, they wanted to introduce water back into the landscape and reintroduce SuDS. So the challenge and where that came from was to meet the supplementary planning guidance Drain London, and the minimum there exceeds what's currently stated within the SuDS standards, and that's to incorporate a 50% betterment rate. So your peak flows coming off the site, they need to be reduced by 50%. And what the client wanted was to provide the drainage features and integrate that with the landscaping features that would be incorporated within the site. As was mentioned in the last presentation, there are no available spaces. We're in the middle of London here. We can't just go next door and say, there's a plot of land, we'll just use that. So there's no additional land take in terms of allocating. We have to work within the perimeter of the site and within the landscape features that we do have. So we want to try and demonstrate how we're meeting the standard SuDS criteria. So that's treatment stages, it's providing storage, and it's also providing the amenity and biodiversity. This stakeholder engagement, it wasn't a canvas on SuDS, it was an overall, in terms of community and stakeholders, what do you want from the redevelopment. But what you will see is crossover and synergy from the aspirations for the redevelopment and what you would be providing through SuDS. So the addition of green space, can we use the landscape green areas within the SuDS? And also at the bottom, which I found actually very interesting, the idea that we don't want a bland landscape in this redevelopment. We want some visual interest. So it could either be public art or some sort of water feature. As human beings, we have this sort of innate connection with water. So it's trying to address that. And I mean, in terms of cost, when we're talking about affordability, I don't know what the going rate. It depends on the artist. Some artists are coming down, and some artists are going up in price at the minute. We all know who those are. But if we're talking about affordability, and we're comparing in terms of value a water asset against a bit of public art, the costs suddenly start to come into kilter. So that sort of leads you into, on this site and on most of our sites, what are the drivers and what are the constraints? Generally speaking, and particularly at the minute, one of the key highlight drivers is to reduce the impact of flooding. In inner city areas, generally speaking, flooding is during the summer, where you have peak intense rainfall events, and the sewers that we have in place are unable to handle those high intensity rainfall events. Spills from CSOs, again, we're quite aware that we have lots of CSOs that spill into watercourses, and we're particularly concerned with the lower return events where there's less dilution within the watercourses to handle that spill. And whilst it hasn't, well, it's always been a problem, but EC regulation and directive are currently tightening that and will do so. So the question is, how do we manage and reduce CSO spill? The way we can reduce CSO spill is to reduce the inflow. So we might not be looking at that point. The driver might be, how do we take the base load, so the first 15, 20, 30 mil out, not the peak. So it's looking at lower events that we might be trying to use to address that. In terms of visual interest, well, that's not really my bag. I'm an engineer. Probably didn't mention that earlier on. But as an engineer, I'm always trying to engage with how I can actually add value through the visual appearance of the schemes. So we're trying to reintroduce water into the landscape. The constraints, well, the key constraint here in terms of storage is the multitude of services that I'll show you in a second. You're in the middle of the financial sector, and there are services pretty much covering the whole site. So in terms of providing any large voids immediately onto the surface, that was pretty much a no-go. On this site we have addition of underground infrastructure. We have a down ramp into an underground car park, which again removed the flexibility in terms of what we could do underground. The area is extensively hard landscaped, and the redevelopment would remain so. We will have planters and those sort of elements integrated into that. We do have a church burial ground, so again, archaeology. So as you work through, the constraints start to build up and up and up, and is working out what is reasonable and practical in those situations. As with most schemes, the timing of input, the SuDS need to be right in at concept stage, so you can drive and get something you can deliver. There's no point coming later on in SuDS design process. Most likely, whenever you're trying to cope with the remainder of constraints, once those design decisions are taken in terms of layout, in terms of land use, it very much takes away from the flexibility of what you can actually bring to the party in terms of SuDS. And I suppose the last one, I sort of mentioned briefly, the fact that you're working with standard streetscape and street furniture palettes, you're constrained by the type of stone you can use, the type of paving you can use to fit in with the overall character. I have absolutely no issue with that, but it has to have a degree of flexibility in terms of how you utilise and bring the SuDS elements into that street furniture. So I'll just let you have a quick look at that. That's one end of the site. That's one of the main roads just down the front of the Gherkin. So that isn't the guy, by the way, digging out the storage tank. That's not him. But that's around the corner, and that shows you what you would expect. So in terms of large underground voids, pretty much out of the question. And getting any storage underground is going to be difficult with that density of service network. But in terms of approaching the design, any design we work with, we start off from a common point, whether it's a redevelopment site, a retrofit site, or a greenfield site. It's to understand the natural hydrology and the hydrology of that catchment. So that is a little contour map. Most of the site is very flat, but there are falls. So we're trying to identify high points and low points, and therefore map how water would flow across that landscape. And by doing that, that's the underground car park ramped down. We're able to then identify subcatchments. So we're not trying to get all the water to one location. We identify compartments within that site, and we deal with the water locally. So in terms of, well, all feasibility studies, you consider all the options at the outset. This probably isn't all of them, but it certainly is a select list. How you convey water from the roof. On this site, we're actually just looking at the ground aspects. The buildings were by themselves, but you want to look at how you can disconnect and bring down the water from the roof. Surface conveyance. Again, once you put water into a gully and take it down into a pipe, you lose the flexibility. So it's how you convey the water across the surface. So it can be channels, rills, and that allows you flexibility in the second. Once you get the water to the component, it allows you to give flexibility. So it's looking about how you can collect water on the surface, how you convey it, and then how you actually start to deal with it. The first one, it's been coined the SuDS planter, but in actual fact all it really is a raised planter that we see very commonly throughout all cities, but trying to introduce water into that element. So I've got trademarking that so you can pay me the royalties whenever it comes in. The tree planters is also another thing we're commonly used to seeing, and it's how we can naturally water those through the surface. There are issues in terms of tree planters and tree cells. Most trees will have an irrigation system which will water, and generally speaking water falls away from the tree planter, not to the tree planter. Permeable surfaces were also considered, so in terms of your conventional permeable pavement, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And the last one, that's well, I'm the engineer, vertical shafts. And this was really born out of the fact that you can't have wide, large footprints. In London, footprint in any sense is a premium, whether you're going up or whether you're going down. So it's how you enhance the storage and provide the offset of storage within a small footprint. I think the phrase was we were trying to meet the deliverables in terms of the 50% betterment and get back to greenfield runoff, and really to do a vertical node into the ground. The engineer said we can do shafts. Shafts we can do. So really he was quite happy with that. This is just around the local landscape in terms of walking around the site and in the vicinity of the site. And what you start to establish is that what we feel is high density landscape in terms of hard landscaping. There are lots of opportunities present in terms of reintroducing water assets and ways of collecting and storing water on the surface. So they are surrounding us, and again it sort of links in with the retrofit aspects. So that one there is the site, and these ones are very close to the site. This is the actual site, and see, I'm an engineer, I can't do these pictures, but it's a landscape architect's appraisal of what the site could look like. Generally speaking, the falls in that site will be off the pedestrian areas onto the road, and within the road, 2 localised gullies. The gullies will then go to the drop shafts, which will go into the sewer system. So that's your general way water is managed in that sort of environment. This is what we looked at in terms of not reinventing the wheel, but how we could reprofile that surface to get water moving in a different direction. So rather than falling off the road, we're falling across and into the planters through grills on the side. So that's designed to deal with both the interception and the first flush. The road could be permeable pavement. The key constraint and the issue that was raised through the consultation with the client is that the density of services in that if you had to dig through the permeable pavement, there was no issue with the construction and the installation. It would be later having to unearth a utility or a service was the issue, and therefore that was ruled out. The irrigation of trees, again, some of the issue around the tree planters is once the roots get out, is compaction. So introduccing ways of supporting the root structure so you can keep the voids in the soil and allow water in that. And this is the vertical shaft. Once you got the water collected through the other mechanisms, that could only store a certain amount. So that was deemed as first flush, and the excess water was then conveyed to, really, in all intents and purposes, an oversized manhole, which could be a hybrid system, rainfall harvesting and attenuation volume, and then that bumped you up to the 50% betterment rate. So we have three scenarios. We could store first flush, that's first 15 mil. We could meet the essential standard, which was 50% betterment, or we could get up to Boris's rate of aspirationally back to greenfield runoff and reduce right back. And you can see that the story is starting to increase. We're only talking about 1,000 to 1,100 square meters here, so it's quite a small site. We have to consider what drivers are applicable, whether it's flooding, CSO spill. One of the requirements in the site was irrigation. They wanted to reuse the water that was stored. So just looking at first flush, typically over a year you will expect high return rainfall. So you can see that graph, which is actually based in Luton, which Norriscombe are involved in, but the vast majority of the rainfall is within either 5 mil to that first 15 mil. So by designing a system to 15 mil, we actually deal with the vast majority of the rainfall that falls on the site. And it's only these excesses then that will go into the sewer system if we look at that scenario. So we have a very effective drainage system from that aspect. It will be utilised right throughout the year.
Okay.
Yeah. So solution delivery. We provide storage within each subcatchment. We provide the irrigation and a way of naturally watering both the planters and the tree systems. And we're able to provide the treatment train and the storage volume. Storage scenarios had to build up. So we built up from first flush within the SuDS planters and 3 vertical nodes to get us up to 50% betterment rate, and then upsizing those nodes to get us up to greenfield runoff. I haven't mentioned it yet, the national standards, there's no mandatory requirement for betterment there at the minute. I feel that's a failing within the national standards and something that should be rectified. We should have a starting point of negotiation. And hopefully that will be something that is reflected in the final edition. So final thoughts. These aren't standard SuDS components that you'll find in the SuDS manual. So you do have to look at ways of innovating and tweaking and bespoking those solutions. So you will require both lateral and vertical thinking. Meeting greenfield runoff rates isn't going to be always achievable on previous developed land sites or retrofit. So it's looking at what's practical and agreeing appropriate betterment rate. If you can collect water in the right way, you will provide those interception losses, because it's about soil moisture deficit, it's about passing water in the right way to do that. As I suppose it's a bit of a catch-all, you have to consider all the alternatives. It's not just a window and considering 1 or 2 and then trying to get an appropriate solution. Consider the full plant. So just to finish off on, there's been a lot of press recently on flooding, and I think it's worthy to note that, well, I dug one out from the BBC website, which is not from the last couple of weeks, it's from a few years back, but it does highlight the fact that our sewer systems in the current context don't work in terms of, we are working inherently with something that is broken, and we're trying to reinvent something. So, a couple of points here. Well, first of all, it was a man started talking about it, and he got a bit nervous, so he handed it over to his lady friend, who continued the conversation. But again, it does pull into context. We have combined systems in most of our cities, and it's trying to reduce the loading of those. And obviously, we don't dispose of unwanted waste in an incorrect way. So, no, thanks for listening. I'm not sure where I should leave that up there or not.